The man was already there. That was the first thing she noticed. The thing that stopped her on the gravel path with the daisies still loose in her hand. For 11 years she had come on Sunday mornings, early, before the church traffic thickened the road, and in 11 years she had never once found someone standing at that stone. The grave sat in the older section of Greenwood, near the low iron fence, under a maple that had been a sapling when they buried him, and was a full tree now. She knew the path to it, the way she knew the inside of her own kitchen. She knew which markers leaned and which had sunk, and which one a groundskeeper had finally straightened 2 summers back, and she knew that nobody else came here. Nobody had ever come here but her. Now, a tall man in a grey wool coat stood with his hat in his hands, his head bowed, his shoulders very still, in front of the marker that read Daniel Whitfield, and she did not know who he was. Renee Carter was 43 years old, and she had been a widow for 11 of those years. She stood maybe 30 feet back on the gravel, and she watched the stranger, and her heart did the thing it had not done in a long time, which was to beat too hard. She told herself there were 100 reasons a man might stand at a grave: a wrong row, a misread name, a funeral home worker checking on a stone. Yet the man was not wandering, and he was not checking anything. He was grieving. She could see it in the set of his back, in the way his weight settled, in the long minute he stood without moving, while the wind pushed at the hem of his coat. He was grieving her husband, and she had no idea who he was. She almost turned around. She almost walked back to the car and drove home, and let the daisies wilt on the passenger seat, and tried again next week. That would have been the easy thing, and Renee had learned over 11 years that the easy thing was usually a door you wished later you had walked through. She did not turn around. She came down the path slow, her flat shoes quiet on the gravel, and when she was close enough that he would hear her, she said gently, so as not to startle him, that she was sorry, she did not mean to intrude. The man lifted his head and turned, and she saw a face she had never seen in her life. He was older than she was, maybe 60, with close-cut grey hair and a heavy brow, and eyes that were red at the rims. He held the hat against his chest like a man who had forgotten he was holding it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved in the maple above them, and somewhere across the cemetery a car door closed, and still neither of them spoke. 2 strangers on either side of a stone that meant something different and the same to each. Then he said her husband's name, not as a question, just said it. Daniel, and his voice broke a little on the second syllable, and Renee felt the morning tilt under her. Before I tell you what he said next, I want you to sit with what it is to keep a promise for 11 years that nobody asked you to keep. Maybe you have a place like that, a bench, a tree, a stretch of road, a stone, somewhere you go to say the things you can no longer say to the person they belong to. If you do, you already know what Renee felt standing on that gravel. Now let me tell you what the man said. He said he was sorry that he had not expected anyone, that he had driven a long way and had told himself he would only stay a minute. He said he had not been certain the grave was even here, that he had been looking for it on and off for the better part of a year. And then he said the thing that Renee would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward. He said that Daniel had saved his life, and that he had spent the last 11 years not knowing the man was dead. Renee did not say anything for a moment. The daisies were sweating in her hand. She had buried a husband she thought she had known completely, a quiet man who fixed transmissions at a shop off Linden Avenue, who took his coffee black and his eggs hard, and who had never in 15 years of marriage mentioned saving anyone's life. She asked the man how. How had Daniel saved him? And the man looked at the stone, and then he looked back at her, and he said it was a long story, and that she might want to sit down for it, and there was a bench under the maple, and the morning was not going anywhere. To understand why that sentence landed the way it did, you have to understand the man Renee had married and the 11 years she had spent missing him. Daniel Whitfield was not a notable man by any measure the world keeps. He had grown up 2 streets over from where they later lived, the youngest of 4, and he had gone to work in a garage at 17 and had stayed in garages, more or less, his whole life. He was good with engines and quiet with people. When Renee met him, she had been 26, working the register at a hardware store, and he had come in 3 Saturdays running to buy the same 40-watt bulb he clearly did not need, and on the 4th Saturday he had asked her, very seriously, if she would have dinner with him, as though the question cost him something. It had. She married him 14 months later, in a small church with 20 folding chairs, and she had been happier in that marriage than she had ever told him, because he was not a man who needed to be told, and because she had assumed they had 40 years to say everything they meant to say. They had 15. He died at 51 of a heart that gave out on a Tuesday afternoon in the bay of the shop between a Buick on the lift and a coffee gone cold on the bench. The men he worked with said it was fast, that he had not suffered, and Renee had clung to that the way you cling to anything in the first weeks, when grief is a flood and you grab whatever floats. She had buried him at Greenwood because his mother was there and his grandmother, and because it had a maple, and Daniel had loved trees. And then she had done the thing she did not plan to do, did not decide to do, simply found herself doing. The Sunday after the funeral, she had bought daisies, because they were cheap and they were his mother's favourite, and she did not know what else to do with her hands, and she had driven to the cemetery and sat with him. And the Sunday after that, she had done it again, and the Sunday after that, 11 years. She did not tell people about the Sundays. Her sister knew and worried about it. In the way, sister's worry said it was not healthy to hold so tight to a stone, said Renee was 43 and ought to be living. Renee did not argue. She only knew that the hour she spent under the maple each week was the 1 hour she felt whole, and a person does not give up the 1 hour, no matter what a sister says. There was a routine to it that she had never written down and could have performed in her sleep. She stopped at the same corner stand on the way and bought the daisies from the same vendor, an older man who had stopped charging her full price somewhere around year 4 and simply wrapped them and waved her on. She parked beyond the iron gate. She walked the gravel to the older section, past the leaning markers she knew by heart, and she swept the leaves or the snow or the maples helicopters off the top of the stone with the side of her hand before she set the flowers down, because Daniel had liked things tidy and she was not going to stop keeping them tidy just because he could not see. She talked to him there. She told them about the shop, which had changed hands twice, about the new owner who meant well and could not read a balance sheet, about the young mechanic who reminded her of Daniel at 20 and did not know it. She told him about her knee, which ached now in the cold. She told him the small news of an ordinary life, and the telling kept him, somehow, in the present tense of her, so that he was not a man who had died, but a man who was simply at work, in the bay, with a Buick on the lift, who would hear all of this when he got home. For 11 years, no one had ever interrupted that hour, until the man in the grey coat. His name was Walter Boyd, and he sat down on the bench beside her, careful, leaving a respectful space between them, and he told her his long story while the maple shifted its shadow across the grass. He said that 12 years ago, the winter before Daniel died, he had been a different man than the one sitting beside her. He had owned a trucking outfit that had gone under, owed money he could not pay, lost the house, lost the marriage that the house had been holding up. He said it without drama, the way men say the worst things, flatly, as if reciting an address. He said that by that January he had decided he was done. He had a plan and a place and a night chosen for it, and the place was the Linden Avenue overpass, and the night was a Thursday. Renee went very still. Walter said he had parked on the shoulder under the overpass that night in a truck that was about to be repossessed, and that he had sat there a long time with the engine off and the cold coming in, working up to it. He described the cold without self-pity, the way it crept up through the floorboards into his boots, the way his breath had fogged the windshield until the streetlights smeared, and how he had been almost grateful for the cold because it made him feel that the decision was already half made by the weather, and that a man had pulled in behind him in an old Ford, a man on his way home from a late shift at a garage, who had seen a vehicle stopped in a strange place on a bitter night and had done what most people would not do, which was stop and knock on the window and ask if the fellow inside was all right. Most people drive past. Walter knew that had driven past stopped cars himself 100 times, and he had never forgotten that this one man, tired from a 10-hour shift, with his own home and his own wife waiting, had chosen not to. He said he had not been all right. He said he had not planned to tell a stranger any of it and had told him all of it there in the cold, the trucking outfit and the house and the marriage and the plan, because something in the man's face made it possible, a plainness, an absence of judgment, as though the man had decided in advance that whatever Walter said would not change the fact that he intended to help, and the man had not lectured him and had not called anyone and had not driven away. He had said, "Come get a cup of coffee, there's a place still open and you can decide after." And Walter had gone, because it was easier in that moment to follow than to finish. The diner was a low brick place with a flickering sign and 3 cars in the lot, the kind that stays open all night for nobody, and a waitress with tired feet had poured them coffee without asking and left the pot. Walter remembered the pot. He remembered the cracked vinyl of the booth and the way the man across from him had wrapped both hands around his cup and not said anything for a while, just let Walter be in a warm, dry place after the cold of the truck. And over coffee, at that diner, whose name Walter never forgot, the man had talked to him for 3 hours, low and unhurried, asking about the trucking outfit and the house and the marriage, not flinching from any of it, treating the worst night of a stranger's life as though it were worth 3 hours of his own. He had not said it would get better. Walter had heard that line before, and it meant nothing. The man had said something harder and truer, that it was bad right now and might stay bad a while, and that the only thing he was asking was that Walter not make a permanent door out of a temporary room. Then he had written a phone number on a napkin with a pen borrowed from the waitress, and had said, "You call me before you do anything, you call me first. Promise me." And Walter had promised, and he had kept the napkin. Rennie was crying now quietly, the way she had learned to cry without sound during 11 years of Sundays. She asked if Daniel had known, if her husband had known what he stopped. And Walter said he thought the man had known exactly what he stopped and had never made him feel small for it, not once, in the months that followed, 'cause it had not ended at the diner. Walter said the man had called him that week to check, and the week after, and had helped him find work at a freight dock through somebody he knew, and had loaned him $300 he plainly could not spare, and had waved off every attempt to pay it back. Walter said they were not close exactly, they did not become best friends. Yet, for most of a year, a quiet man from a garage had kept a loose, steady hand on his shoulder until Walter was standing on his own again, and then the calls had tapered the way they do, and life had carried them apart. He said the last time they spoke was that autumn. Daniel had called to say a job had come through, a better one in another state, and that Walter should take it, and Walter had taken it, and had moved, and had meant to call when he was settled, and had not, the way you mean to and do not. He had built a new life 2 states over. He had remarried. He had gotten healthy in the ways that matter. And he had assumed for 11 years that the man who pulled in behind him on the worst night of his life was still out there somewhere. Black coffee and hard eggs. Fixing transmissions off Linden Avenue. He had not learned otherwise until 3 weeks ago, when a man he used to work the freight dock with had mentioned in passing that he had heard the fellow from the old garage had passed years back his heart. And Walter had gone home that night and taken an old napkin out of a drawer where he had kept it for 12 years. A napkin with a phone number that no longer rang, and he had decided he could not let it stand that he had never said thank you. You keep a ledger without knowing you are keeping it. The small kindnesses you do, the ones you forget by the next morning, they do not forget you. Daniel had stopped a truck on a cold night and bought a stranger a cup of coffee, and had gone home and most likely never mentioned it, because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who did the right thing when no one was watching and saw no reason to announce it. And 11 years after his heart stopped in the bay of a garage, that one cold night came walking up the gravel in a grey wool coat to stand at his grave. Renee had thought she knew everything there was to know about her husband. She was learning on a bench under a maple that the best of him had happened in the places she could not see. They sat for a long time. The maple let down its light in coins across the grass, and a groundskeeper passed once at a distance with a wheelbarrow and did not bother them. Walter asked her about Daniel, the ordinary things, what he was like at home, whether he had been happy, and Renee found herself telling a stranger the things she usually only told the stone. She told him about the 40-watt bulbs. She told him about the way Daniel hummed off-key when he cooked and pretended he had not when she caught him, how he would deny it with a straight face, while the radio was plainly off and the only music in the kitchen had been him. She told him how Daniel kept a coffee can of spare bolts on the back porch and could never throw a working part away, how the garage at home was a museum of other people's broken things he meant to fix and sometimes did. She told him about the trees, how Daniel could name them all and would slow the car to point one out, a sycamore, a hackberry, a black walnut, until she had learned them too, without meaning to, until now she could not drive a country road without naming what stood along it and hearing his voice do it first. And Walter listened the way you listen when you've been given back a piece of someone, hungry and grateful, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees and his hat still in his hands, and when she finished he was quiet. And then he said that it made sense to him, all of it, that the man who could stop on a bridge for a stranger was exactly the man she was describing. He said it was the smallness of it that he had never gotten over, not a grand gesture. A cup of coffee in 3 hours, and a phone number on a napkin, given to a man who could do nothing for him in return by a man who clearly did not have 3 hours or $300 to spare, and gave them anyway. Before he left that morning, Walter asked if he might come back. Not every Sunday, he said quickly. He would not intrude on her hour. He understood what it was. Someday, though, to pay his respects properly with more than a year of looking behind him and no warning to her. Renee said yes. She said he was welcome any Sunday he liked, that the hour was big enough, and she meant it, though she did not fully understand yet why she meant it. They exchanged numbers the way people do now, and Walter Boyd walked back up the gravel path to a car she had not noticed parked beyond the iron gate, and she sat alone with Daniel and the daisies, and she told him out loud that a man had come, and that she finally understood why he used to come home so late some nights and say only that the world was hard on people and somebody had to be soft. What Renee did not know, sitting on that bench, was that Walter Boyd had not told her everything. He had told her the truth. All of it, but not all of it at once, because some things you cannot say to a grieving woman in the first hour of meeting her, and because Walter was a careful man who had learned the hard way that timing is its own kind of kindness. There was more to why he had spent a year looking for the grave. There was a reason it had taken him so long, and a reason he had finally found it, and the reason had a name and an account and a great deal of money, and it would change the shape of Renee Carter's life. That morning, though, he only drove away, and Renee only drove home, and the daisies finally went into a jar on the windowsill, the way they did every Sunday, and the week turned over, the way weeks do. He called on Wednesday. He apologized for calling so soon, said he hoped it was not too much. And then he asked if he might take her to lunch, because there was something he wanted to tell her in a place that was not a graveyard. Renee, who had not had lunch with a man in 11 years, said yes before her sister's voice could rise up in her head and say, "Be careful." They met at a diner off the highway, different diner from the one in the story, and over coffee Walter told her the rest of it, and the rest of it was this. He had ordered nothing but the coffee and turned the cup a quarter turn on its saucer a few times before he started, and Renee had recognized the gesture as the thing a careful man does when he is about to say something he has rehearsed in the car. The new life Walter had built 2 states over had not been a small one. The freight dock had led to a dispatching job, and the dispatching job had led to a small company of his own, 2 trucks and a phone and a calendar on the wall, and the small company had grown, slow and steady over a decade, the way Daniel's kindness had been slow and steady, into something that was not small at all. Walter Boyd was a wealthy man. He told her this plainly, without pride, looking at the coffee and not at her, the way you confess a thing rather than boast it, and then he told her why it mattered to her. He said that for years as the company grew he had set money aside. A fund, he called it, though it had no formal name at first. Every year on a certain January night, the anniversary of the bridge, he had moved a sum into an account, and told no one what it was for. He had thought in the early years that someday he would find the man from the garage and pay back the $300 1,000 times over, would buy him a new truck, would do something enormous and embarrassing and make the quiet man wave it off. That had been the plan, insofar as he had a plan. And then he had let the years get away from him, the way you do when you assume there is time, and by the time he went looking, the man was 11 years gone, and you cannot write a check to a stone. The man had a wife, though. Walter had learned that quickly once he started looking in earnest, and he had learned from the same old freight dock friend and from a few careful questions around Linden Avenue that the wife still came to the grave, faithful, every Sunday. 11 years on. Pah! He said he had driven to Greenwood that morning not knowing if she would be there, half hoping she would not, because he had not worked out what to say. And she had come down the path with daisies in her hand, and he had understood, standing at that stone, that the money he had been setting aside for 12 years did not belong to him and never really had. It belonged to the man who had stopped on the bridge, and the man was gone, and so it belonged to the woman who had kept his memory faithful for 11 years, when no one was watching, exactly as her husband had once been faithful to a stranger when no one was watching. Renee told him she could not take his money. She said it the way she had said no to her sister's offers and her church's offers, and every well-meant hand extended to her over 11 years, because she was a proud woman and she had always managed, on what the shop's new owner paid her to keep the books, and on what Daniel had left, which was not much but was paid off. Walter did not argue with her. He'd expected the refusal, had counted on it, even, because a woman who would take the money easily was not the woman Daniel would have married. He only said one thing. He said that Daniel had not stopped on the bridge because Walter deserved it. He had stopped because that was what you do, and that the not deserving was the whole point, and that if Renee turned this away, she was deciding she knew better than her husband had about who was owed kindness. Then he let it sit. She did not answer that day. She drove home, and she did not sleep, and on Sunday she went to the grave, and she sat under the maple, and she asked Daniel what she was supposed to do. The way she asked him things she already half knew the answer to. The maple did not answer, but the daisies were bright in her hand, and she thought about the 40-watt bulbs, 4 Saturdays of a shy man, buying a thing he did not need just to stand near her. She thought about all the hands she had refused over 11 years. Her sister, who had offered to take her in the first winter when the house felt like a coat 2 sizes too big. The churchwomen who had brought casseroles. She had thanked and frozen and let go bad, because accepting them felt like agreeing she was a woman who needed casseroles. The new owner at the shop, who had quietly tried to give her a raise, she had talked him out of because she did not want it to look like charity for the widow. She had built a fortress out of managing, and she had called the fortress Dignity. And, sitting under the maple, she wondered for the first time whether it had been dignity at all or just another kind of fear. She had married a man who stopped, and she had spent 11 years refusing every hand because taking help felt like admitting she could not hold the stone alone. Maybe, she thought, the holding and the help were not opposites. Maybe Daniel would have wanted her to let somebody pull in behind her on a cold night. She called Walter on Monday. She did not say yes to the money, not yet, not all of it. She said she would let him help her with one thing, the thing that had been quietly breaking her for 2 years, and that she had told no one, not her sister, not the stone. The house she and Daniel had shared, the house with the windowsill where the daisies went, was about to be lost. Daniel had paid it off, yes, but a second mortgage taken to cover the medical bills after his death had grown teeth. She could not feed, and the letters from the bank had moved from polite to final, and Renee had been making peace with the idea of losing the one place that still held the shape of him. She had not been able to say it out loud to anyone. She said it to Walter on the phone on a Monday, because he was a stranger and because he was not a stranger at all, and Walter Boyd was quiet for a moment, and then he said in a voice that was steadier than hers that this was exactly what the money was for, and that Daniel would have liked knowing the house was safe. It took a few weeks to untangle. Walter knew people, accountants and a lawyer, the kind of help that money buys and that Renee had never had access to in her life, and they went through the bank's letters and the numbers and the second mortgage, and what had been an impossible mountain to a woman keeping books for a transmission shop became, in their hands, a problem with a solution. Renee sat in on the first meeting in a conference room with a long table and water in glass bottles, and she had brought every letter in a shoebox because she did not own a folder for them, and she had felt the old shame rise up at the shoebox until the lawyer, a soft-spoken woman about her own age, had said it was the most organized box of records she had seen all month, and meant it. They found that some of the late fees had been wrongly compounded, that the bank had not in 2 places done its own arithmetic correctly, and watching a professional catch in 20 minutes, what had quietly crushed Renee for 2 years was its own strange grief. The grief of how much easier some lives are made by the people who can be hired to stand between you and the machine. The debt was paid. The house was hers clear, with papers to prove it, and there was more besides. Set into an account in her name that would mean she did not have to keep books into her 70s if her knee got worse, that she could slow down, that she could rest. Renee signed the papers at a table in the lawyer's office with her hands shaking, and when it was done she went out to her car and sat in it in the parking garage and cried for a long time. Not the silent crying of 11 years of Sundays, but the other kind. The kind that comes when a weight you have carried so long you forgot it was a weight is finally set down. She kept going to the grave. That did not change, and Walter never asked it to. Some Sundays she went alone, and some Sundays as the months went on Walter came too, driving the long way from his life 2 states over, more often than a wealthy man with a business to run had any reason to, and they would sit on the bench, under the maple, the 2 people in the world who had been kept by Daniel Whitfield, and they would talk. They became, slowly, the kind of friends that grief makes, which is a particular and unbreakable kind. Walter's wife came once, a kind woman named Joyce, who took Renee's hands in both of hers at the graveside and said thank you to the stone for her husband. And Renee understood that the circle of people Daniel had saved without meaning to was wider than even Walter knew, that it reached into a marriage 2 states away, into children Walter had been alive to raise, into a whole life that existed because a quiet man stopped on a bridge. On a Sunday, near the first anniversary of the morning Walter appeared, Renee came to the grave and found again that she was not the first one there. This time, though, she knew the grey coat. Walter stood at the stone with his hat in his hands, and beside him stood a young man she had not met, broad through the shoulders the way young men are, in a jacket a size too nice for a cemetery, turning a set of khakis over and over in one hand. When she came down the path, Walter introduced him as his son, grown now, who had wanted to come and see the grave of the man his father credited with his whole second life, with everything that came after, including the son himself. The young man shook Renee's hand and called her ma'am, and said that his father had told him the story so many times growing up that he had half believed it was a fable. The man on the bridge, the coffee, the napkin, until he was old enough to understand that his own existence hung on it, that if the man in the old Ford had driven past like everyone else, there would have been no second marriage and no house in another state and no him. He stood a little awkwardly the way the young do at graves, looking at the name on the stone as though trying to match it to the size of what it had done, and Renee looked at him and thought that this person was alive in the most literal sense because Daniel had been soft on a hard night, and she had to turn away for a moment and look at the maple until she could speak. She brought daisies that Sunday as always, and she set them at the base of the stone. And Walter had brought flowers too, and his son had brought a single sunflower that he set down a little apart, not knowing the family code of daisies, and Renee found that she did not mind, that the sunflower belonged there as much as anything. The 3 of them stood under the tree that Daniel had loved, in the section of Greenwood where no one used to come, and Renee thought about the 11 years she had stood there alone, certain that the keeping of him was hers and hers only, a solitary devotion no one shared or even knew. She had been wrong about that, and she was glad to have been wrong. The keeping had never been hers alone. It had only felt that way because the others had not known where to come. You spend years thinking grief is the loneliest room there is, and then one Sunday a door opens that you did not know was a door, and someone walks through it carrying a piece of the person you lost, a piece you never had, and the room is suddenly larger and warmer than you understood. That was what Daniel gave her in the end. 11 years after he was gone. Not the money, though the money lifted the weight and saved the house. He gave her the knowledge that the man she had loved had been even better than she knew. In the dark where it counted, where no one keeps score but the universe seems to. Anyway, he gave her Walter and Joyce and a young man with a sunflower. He gave her proof that the quiet good a person does not die with them, that it goes on walking around in the world wearing other people's lives. The house is hers now, fully. The windowsill and the jar and the room where Daniel used to hum off-key over the stove. She has slowed down at the shop, keeps the books 2 days a week now instead of 5, and on the other days she has started doing a thing that would have made Daniel smile, which is to drive out to the cemetery on no particular schedule, not only Sundays, and walk the older section near the iron fence and notice the graves that no one comes to. There are always graves that no one comes to. She has learned some of their names now, the leaning markers, the sunken ones, the names worn nearly smooth, and she has wondered about each of them the way she never used to have the room to wonder when grief took up all the space in her, whether they had a Walter somewhere. A stranger they had been quietly kind to on a cold night who never knew where to come and say, "Thank you." She has taken to leaving a daisy at a few of them, on the chance that the leaving counts for something even when no one living is left to receive it. The vendor at the corner stand sells her extra daisies now and does not ask why, only adds a few to the bundle and waves her on the way he has for years. The way Daniel once added 3 hours and $300 to a stranger's worst night and waved it off. She still talks to Daniel under the maple. She tells him the news, the same as ever, her knee and the shop and the weather. Now, though, she tells him about Walter's calls and Joyce's letters, and the young man who writes to her sometimes, who sent her a photograph of his own new baby in the spring, with a note that said the family Daniel saved had grown by 1 more. She reads him the note out loud at the stone, 'cause she likes to think he can hear, and because after everything she is no longer sure he cannot. And every Sunday, 11 years, and then 12, and now more, she sets the daisies down at the base of the marker that reads Daniel Whitfield, and she sits a while in the shade of the tree he loved, in the company of a man who was good when it cost him and told no one, and she is not lonely there anymore. If you have ever done a quiet kindness and watched it vanish, given a stranger a coffee, a coat, a hand on a cold night, and never heard another word, I hope this finds the part of you that wondered whether it mattered. It mattered. Somewhere a napkin is in a drawer with your number on it. And if a story like this one is the kind you needed tonight, stay a while, because there is another one waiting, about a woman who fed a man at her back door for 6 winters and learned at last whose son he was,